All right, gentlemen, we're going to look at Section 4, the Office of the President. So let's actually see what's going on in the White House and if it's really just a big house. Well, back in the day, it kind of was more of just a house. As your book noted, it wasn't until 1857 that a president was allowed to have a secretary paid for with government funds. So the first president to have a secretary was the least effective one, Mr. James Buchanan. It wasn't until after President McKinley's assassination that the Secret Service was assigned bodyguard duty. Prior to that, presidents, if they wanted a bodyguard, basically hired one. It wasn't until after the creation of the Bureau of the Budget in 1921 that presidents were able to submit a presidential budget. Abraham Lincoln answered some of his own mail. Grover Cleveland answered the phone. So there wasn't a whole lot of presidential White House bureaucracy up until the more recent era. Today, we know far different. All you have to do is watch TV. You don't have to go to the White House. You don't have to work at the White House. You don't have to know anybody to know it has turned into its own world. Right? The Office of the Presidency has become a massive to-do. Marine guards and helicopters and limos and an army of Secret Service agents and an army of cooks and waiters and butlers and secretaries and all these advisors, right? It has turned into, as your book noted, one of the largest or fastest growing bureaucracies in the government, if you just do percentage of growth. Then you think about the fact that every president has the ability to name people to the cabinet, to the courts, to various agencies and task forces and special presidential whatevers he composes. He's got a lot of patronage at his disposal when you really start to think about it. And it has turned into an army of assistants, but it's also turned into an army that requires control and management, and it's become a bit unwieldy for some presidents. And it has become a distraction in some cases. But the president keeps his closest advisors close at hand. The White House is full of offices with people who have jobs that are not clearly defined all the time. You have a lot of assistants and counselors and assistants to the president and special consultants and all sorts of fun titles. I always like to point out when I'm teaching my American history class that Henry Kissinger's original job title when it came to dealing with Vietnam, or when he first came into the White House, Henry Kissinger's job title was, hang on a moment, I don't want to get it wrong. It was like special, is it assistant or something of that nature? Like it was a made-up title. Like he wasn't Secretary of State. Everybody thinks he was Secretary of State. He eventually was, but he wasn't originally the Secretary of State. He eventually became the National Security Advisor, but even before that, he was, I can't remember off the top of my head, but he was originally given a title that would allow him the flexibility and freedom to kind of do what he wanted, right? Or do what Nixon wanted. That way there was no kind of tying him down and keeping him from playing whatever role Richard Nixon wanted. The White House is full of these people, right? And so, here we go. His original title, Special Assistant for National Security Affairs. What does that mean? Like, what do you do? You're not just the assistant, you're the special assistant for National Security Affairs. Don't we have a National Security Advisor? Shouldn't he be your right-hand man? After all, he's your National Security Advisor. But instead, you're going to pick a guy who apparently is special, but instead of putting him in charge, you're going to give him a job under the National Security Advisor, technically speaking. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. The White House is full of these, right? And there's no law saying that the president can't do that. Who is Congress to tell the president that he can't name somebody special assistant to national security, right? And so the White House has got a ton of these people. And it varies, the number of them, the titles. But in general, they are basically the president's chief people on these policies. Now, these people don't have to be confirmed by the United States Senate because they are not secretaries. They are not officially part of the bureaucracy. In 2013, the Obama White House had approximately 460 such staff members when you add them all up, right? Now, how does the president organize the White House staff setup? Okay, well, there are three general organizational flows. There's the pyramid structure, the circular structure, and the ad hoc structure. Okay? There's no reason for the big. There you go. All right? So pyramid, circular, ad hoc. All right? The pyramid structure, which was used primarily by Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, both Bushes, and Clinton after a while. Okay? It is, as the name would imply, pyramid in general shape. Information kind of gets funneled up through the lower levels to the mid levels to the secretaries and directors of the various organizations, the cabinet level, to a chief of staff who then is the bearer of good or bad news to the president, right? So you don't actually go to the president, you go to the chief of staff who then takes it to the president, and they might take you along, right? The circular structure, popular with President Jimmy Carter, basically all the cabinet secretaries and assistants and whoever else is in the cabinet reports directly to the president, right? So basically cabinet meetings are everybody takes a turn. And then there's the ad hoc structure. The ad hoc structure, which was popular with President Clinton early on, is where basically you don't have a set structure, hence the term ad hoc. You have, close friends and advisors, informal groups, committees, task forces, who are going to help. A great example, when Clinton went to reform health care early in his presidency, he did not put the head of the Health and Human Services in charge, right? That would make sense. He didn't put a cabinet secretary in charge of it. He put his wife in charge of it. That's right. So First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton was in charge of spearheading the campaign by the White House to reform health care. Also, when he wanted to reform and streamline the bureaucracy, the famed National Performance Review that we'll talk more about in Chapter 11, if I remember correctly, was not led by the Office of Management and Budget, which would make sense. Nope. It was an advisor to Vice President Al Gore. It wasn't Vice President Al Gore. It was an advisor to him, a woman by the name of Elaine Camargue. Right? So the Clinton White House was more likely to go get people that they wanted instead of the actual person that should be in charge of it based on who has what job in the Constitution or in the actual government. Now, it's not set in stone. Presidents can vary. Presidents can change. I just mentioned Clinton started out ad hoc, and he eventually went more pyramid structure. Franklin Roosevelt, he tended to waffle between circular and ad hoc. It depended. Well, and he actually used all three. He bounced between ad hoc and circular when it came to domestic policy. And then he would oftentimes go pyramid structure when dealing with issues involving foreign policy and the military, right? So he kind of waffled around depending on what the program or the topic was. And it's not to say, again, that presidents can't have that one area or aspect where they go back and forth. It's common that there is a degree of all three. If there's anybody who was even Richard Nixon, who was really kind of locked in on the pyramid structure for quite some time. Let's think about this. When it came to Vietnam, yeah, he was doing this, right? Also, when it came to Watergate, he was obviously doing this. Most things he was doing this. Excuse me. But on a handful of topics that were near and dear and vital to him, he jumped over to this one. Now, there's pros and cons to each method. All right. The pyramid structure provides a very straightforward, orderly organizational network, right? There's not a whole lot of confusion. You know that you are to hand things to uppercase A, who then hands it to the secretary of whatever department we work in. There is no question as to who do I report to, where does this go, how does this flow. right? But a great problem is there is the issue of the president gets information after it has passed through multiple screening processes, so to speak. There's a chance the president will not get information that the president might want, or the president could be misinformed, because every person along this chain kind of distills and processes and determines what gets passed on. It's not like the chief of staff gets the initial information, the initial report, right? This report gets combined with this report, and this guy kind of makes a summary that he hands to this guy who, and by the time it hits the president, it's gone through all these screens and filters, and things have been taken out, and things have been edited ever so slightly, so there's a chance the president will be misinformed or isolated from the original source information. The circular method is the method that gives the president the most honest and true flow of information, because he's getting it from the quote-unquote horse's mouth. But you're going to have information overflow. There is no distillation process. It's the raw, real deal, right? So you avoid the flaw of the pyramid structure where the president might not get all the information to the president gets all the information, which could be information overflow and overwhelm these people and the president, because there is no boiling it down, which is oftentimes the biggest flaw of Jimmy Carter, in my opinion. Brilliant man. The problem was he tried to solve every problem at once. And being a good old-fashioned nuclear engineer, he wanted every scrap of information he could get before he proceeded forward. And that's not how government works. Sometimes you just got to go with what you know. The ad hoc structure provides the most flexibility, allows you to avoid a lot of bureaucracy, and it also allows you to avoid what we call bureaucratic inertia, right, where kind of bureaucracy takes on its own life that we've talked about. And it allows you to kind of go outside the box, right? It allows you to do things that these structures don't allow, because, again, it provides you a flexibility and a way to kind of set your own flow. But it risks cutting the president off from the government officials and the government officials from one another. And it basically can create a disconnect in the formulation of policy, in the implementation of policy. Because your problem is some of these people aren't actually responsible for doing anything. Like when it comes to carrying out the will that comes out of the White House, right? So I threw up here some example. I tried to create an example. And just talking about like the opioid crisis, right? Let's talk about the opioid crisis for a moment. Let's make that our example. Okay, let's say we got a president who's using the ad hoc flow, right? And so, let's get a pen up here. All right, so the president is going to have a couple of committees in the Senate dealing with this. I don't know what they would be. There might even be a Senate Select Committee, right? Whatever, okay? So they're giving the president their input. And of course, that's based on senators and testimony and whatever. Meanwhile, this president has got some, bigwig friends and advisors who have connections to Big Pharma. So they're getting the information from Big Pharma. For those of you wondering, the company that originally developed OxyContin, which is the origin of the opioid crisis in this country, that company was called Purdue Pharmacy, a pharmaceutical. So you've got representatives and lobbyists from Big Pharma, who are talking to friends and advisors of the president. You've got the president's special task force, which is not a congressional committee, right? It's the Presidential Task Force on Opioids. And of course, this includes members of the DEA, the FBI, maybe some state police organizations, Coast Guard, I don't know, right? A bunch of Homeland Security, whatever. Right? All these different folks are coming to the president with all sorts of information and ideas. And here's what's great, though, if you think about it. These people are going to be talking, to these folks, but they might also be called to report to the Senate committee, right? These guys might also be called to testify, but they're also working over here, with these folks doing their thing, and these people might have conflicting reports or advice, right? And nothing is set in stone that says that these guys are going to be telling these, that these guys are going to have the same exact story between these two paths. The whole issue is just, it's a whole lot of kind of random groups coming from random angles. And then you think about it, at the end of the day, the only people who actually have any say in what's going to be the law are these people. These guys don't know exactly what, just because you're the president's buddy from way back when doesn't mean that you actually understand how this is going to be implemented. It's like we talked about. Oh, it seems like a great idea to do this. What are the long-term consequences? How are we going to pay for it? Who's going to be in charge of it? Does it run counter to any other existing legislation or programs? These people might not know all that, right? They're not specialists. They're just friends. Okay? So there's a problem with that. Now, all presidents, of course, claim, they will say openly, they're up for any advice. And I will say that if you use the circular method, you are really opening yourself up to all sorts of advice. But most presidents discover, as did even Jimmy Carter, that it's difficult to manage a large, freewheeling bureaucracy. And so you kind of have to pick and choose who you're really going to give the floor to. This sounds like a great idea, but let's be real. Not everybody can have their 10 minutes at the meeting. So you get to where there are a couple of chief people that you really rely on, and the rest are secondary or tertiary players at best. Okay? For example, in July of 1979, Carter dramatically changed how things were done in the White House when he elevated Hamilton Jordan to the post of Chief of Staff, coordinating a number of other positions. So basically, he was like, look, I can't have this big unwieldy meeting. You guys all report to him, and then he will give me a summary of all of your reports, right? And you guys still get to talk. Things like that. As I said, at first, Ronald Reagan, well, I did not say it first. At first, Ronald Reagan tried to kind of compromise between circular and pyramid. He had 3 key aides. So basically, he had 3 people reporting to him, and those 3 people basically took the reports of everybody else. But at the start of his second term, he shifted to a more pyramid structure, and basically everybody answered to the chief of staff, who then gave him the distilled version. As I said, Clinton. He began ad hoc, but then he eventually shifted to more pyramid. I will say that White House senior staff members are usually drawn from the campaign staff. Because if you think about it, in order to get to the presidency, you got to go through that long, windy road of the campaign. And you build a certain rapport and trust with the president. You've been through a lot. You've proven yourself at handling and managing bureaucracy to start with. Right? Because campaigns are a bureaucracy in and of themselves. They're a very weird, very fluid bureaucracy. So if you can help make a successful campaign, you've probably got the chops to manage government bureaucracy. So you shouldn't be shocked when a president wins an election if he almost immediately fills some of the highest level positions in his staff at the White House with the people who helped him get there. A few, though, will be brought in afterwards. Famous example, Harvard professor Henry Kissinger, who was brought in as special assistant for national security affairs. And I apologize for me foolishly looking through my American history textbook when I knew that information was right like 3 paragraphs down the road. But yeah, he went and he was like, look, this guy really knows his stuff. He's got a really interesting take on how to handle the Cold War. I'm going to bring him in. Kissinger had nothing to do with the presidential campaign at all. Nothing at all. His name was never mentioned in the campaign. After Nixon won, he's like, yeah, I'm getting this guy from Harvard. And these offices, these are not as big and spacious as fancy. These are not the kind of positions that people spend their lives aiming for. It's the kind of thing you just end up in. Also, it's not always a promotion, so to speak. There are people who take pay cuts to work at the White House. It's a temporary pay cut, first of all, as we shall see. But some people do it because it's not about the money. It's about the position, right? A lot of people will give up a lot of things to be in the White House. right? To be down the hall from the President of the United States, to be a person who the President comes to once a week and asks for input and guidance and advice, right? And so that's why it occurs. All right, now I'm going to switch over to a PowerPoint. I figured it was better if I showed you kind of a chart flow of some of these things. Now, we got through how we're going to structure it. All right, what is the office of the presidency? Okay, well, there is the executive office, okay? There is actually something termed the executive office. And the agencies within the executive office report directly to the president, but they are not actually located in the White House itself. There's only so much room in the White House, kids. And so there are these agencies that report directly to the president of the United States, but they don't work in the White House. And the people who work there may or may not have an intimate personal relationship with the president, or direct contact with the president. By that I mean, they might be in cabinet meetings, they might be regularly called upon to meet with the president, or have regular phone call or teleconference, or they might just send reports and that's it. Now, people at the top of these organizations are, they are filled by presidential appointment. But unlike White House staff positions, you have to be confirmed, right? Because these are real positions. These aren't made up. For example, the National Security Council is a real institution that basically Congress demands oversight over. And so these are people who do have to go through Senate confirmation hearings. These agencies are, and they are listed in your book, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Director of National Intelligence, the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, which we're going to talk more about here in a moment, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and the Office of the Vice President. Now, of all of these, your most important is probably the Office of Management and Budget. If you want to talk about really having involvement with the president on a regular basis, and they providing him with information and guidance that will affect across a broad spectrum, the Office of Management and Budget is the one. It was originally called the Bureau of the Budget when it was created in 1921, but they changed the name in 1970, in part because it is not just about the budget. It is not just a bunch of bean counters who give the president financial figures that he's supposed to operate off of. The Office of Management and Budget, it studies organizational operations and basically, I don't want to say ergonomics, but something along that line. I mean, it looks at efficiency. It looks at waste. It calculates efficiency and waste. It offers plans for reorganization, ways to better streamline. It reviews proposals and, again, tries to isolate or pinpoint spots where greater efficiency or there is an overflow of waste that needs to be dealt with. And so what the OMB provides the president is information that will be used and put into play on other programs, right? So they give advice that will touch upon all the aspects of the world that is the president. On the quiz, a number of you missed the question on the cabinet. There is no reference to the cabinet in the United States Constitution. Okay? The cabinet is not dictated by the United States Constitution. The Constitution grants the president will have some advisors, etc., but there is no actual attendance list, if you will, dictated by the United States Constitution. Matter of fact, those of you who had my American history class might remember that George Washington kind of made the bureaucracy, when he first showed up, and he determined who and what and how. And his cabinet, was really his department heads and not a whole lot else, but he didn't have as much as the rest of us to have to deal with necessarily. Your book said the cabinet is the product of hope and tradition. It is not established by the Constitution. At one time, the heads of the federal government, or federal departments, I should say, met regularly. And there are some people who would like to see that be the way that it is. Okay? But really, the Constitution, all it says, the Constitution doesn't mention the cabinet. The 25th Amendment implicitly defines it as consisting of the principal offices of the executive department. But there's no guarantee that that's how it's going to flow or be. And again, when Washington tried to get a cabinet together, he found that he couldn't put Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson in the same room because all they did was argue with one another. They didn't talk to him; they just argue with each other. John Adams and Abraham Lincoln did not have as much success creating a cabinet out of department heads. Your issue is if there's a member of a department who has a rivalry with another member of a department, that's going to become a problem. You're going to have feuds. And then you think about who gets these positions, there's a very good chance that they are people who have battled each other in the past for influence in position and policy, right? Dwight Eisenhower is probably the one, or the president who the most came to making his cabinet represent what we sometimes like to think it is, right? I think a lot of people, again, this is going back to myth versus reality or hope versus reality. We like to imagine that the Congress, everybody sits down and one at a time they stand up and they speak their piece, right? And then we vote when it's all said and done. And I said that's not even close to how it is. I think we like to imagine that the cabinet is an organization where there's a presentation. Everybody sits around the big table, right? There's a presentation, and then every member of the cabinet puts in their 2 cents, and there's a little bit of a friendly back and forth. And then the president makes a decision based on all that information. Okay? No, that's not how it works. Eisenhower is the one who came closest. He made sure that there was a large staff present. He held regular meetings, and he quietly listened. He did not dominate his cabinet meetings. But honestly, Eisenhower's cabinet did not have much influence over his decisions. And he did not effectively use it to get control of the government, per se. It sounds like, or it feels like Eisenhower, he already really had his mind made up. He just basically had cabinet meetings to see if anybody was going to change his mind. By custom, cabinet officers are the head of the 15 major executive departments. There was a chart in your book that shows you when they were created and about how many employees exist in each department. Their order of creation is unimportant except in protocol, 2 protocols actually. You sit depending on the age of the department. So the Secretary of State sits next to the President on one side and the Secretary of Treasury on the next, and thus we work our way down the table. Basically, the people who sit furthest away from the President are the ones whose departments are the most recently created. So I guess the Homeland Security sits at the furthest end of the table, theoretically. There's another aspect to this. Again, if you were to have the horrific event where the president, the vice president, the speaker, and the president pro tempore are all killed, then you go to department heads for who becomes president next. So the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Defense, working your way down. Not that that's ever going to happen. But again, there's this chart here. Let's go and look at it. There you go. And you can see how many employees roughly are in each of these departments. You'll notice the rather unwieldy Homeland Security, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on when we look at bureaucracy. Okay, so just for a quick fact, whenever somebody's like, I'm going to help trim the budget by getting rid of the Department of Education, wow, yeah, that's really going to knock it out. Congratulations, you're going to trim the smallest of the government departments. I don't think that's going to really balance the budget, but you can go for it. But there you go. All right. Another thing the president has control over, he gets to appoint people to the 4 dozen or so agencies and commissions that are not considered part of the cabinet and that by law are quasi-independent. What is the difference between an executive department or agency and an independent agency? We're not real sure. I like how your book said that. We're not really sure. There's no precise definition. In general, it does mean that heads of executive agencies serve at the pleasure of the president and can be removed at his discretion. They can be hired and fired at will. Heads of major independent agencies have fixed terms of office and can only be fired for cause. All right? The president also appoints federal judges. Of course, he has to get that approved by Congress, actually by Senate, I should say. Federal judges serve for life unless are removed by impeachment and conviction. All right. And of course, we all know the reason for that is to maintain some level of independence of the judiciary from the executive branch. So some of you might be saying, I want to get appointed to some sort of important job serving the president and the federal government. All right, well, let me tell you who usually gets there. Okay, first of all, a lot of appointments are people the president doesn't know. Okay, the president knows very few of the people he's going to appoint to any position. Unlike a parliament where you become prime minister and you know everybody that you're going to give a job to because you all work together in parliament. Remember, a prime minister comes from parliament. Very few presidents come from the legislative branch, as we said. A lot of them come from the military. A lot of them come from state government. A handful have come from the vice president. Very few, what did I say, 13% or 12%, come from the legislature and then go to the presidency. So very few of them have direct contact with a lot of the legislative branch. And even then, you rarely appoint legislators to serve in government positions, right? Or executive office positions. And so instead, what you do is you get a lot of people from, as you can see, from business, universities, think tanks, law firms, various interest groups, various constituencies. You might get former congressmen. You might get a governor here or there, whatever it is, right? A president, in a cabinet, in parliament, everybody's basically going to usually agree. Not always. I'm not saying that like Margaret Thatcher never had an argument with her cabinet. I'm just saying you're going to have a lot more unity in a parliamentary cabinet, I would assume, than you will in a presidential cabinet. Because again, in a parliamentary cabinet, everyone's job is dependent on party unity and agreeing. In a presidential cabinet, not necessarily the case. President Reagan made an effort to guarantee that members of his cabinet were ideologically on his team. But, it wasn't very long before Secretary of State Alexander Haig got into a bunch of arguments with other members of the White House staff and was asked to resign. It has become very apparent that the key to staying on the current president's cabinet, is to show him loyalty and just approve or agree with what he says. It's become quite apparent. If you argue with Donald Trump, you will be out of a job very quickly. At least in the White House. Not every president is that way. Some of them have been known to have rather combative relationships with some of their cabinet members, but they need that counsel, right? Franklin Roosevelt was known for having a cabinet that did not get along. That's not to say they didn't necessarily get along with him, but he was known to purposely appoint people to the cabinet that he knew would cause friction with other members of the cabinet because he wanted to have diverse opinions and arguments and ideas, right? So if it's not from the legislature, who gets onto the cabinet? Okay? Well, most of them will have some prior federal experience, okay? Your book talked about how about 85% of cabinet and sub-cabinet and independent agency appointees have some prior federal experience, okay? So somewhere in their background, they have already worked in the federal government, probably, like a lot of careers. They started out doing some menial something, and then they got promoted, but then their party lost the White House, so they lost their job. Maybe they came back, a decade later with a slightly better job, but a lot of them have some sort of prior federal experience. Okay? And then, they'll lose their federal job, but then they'll go back home and get a job at the state government level or whatever, right? But not necessarily. They might float between government and the private sector, as we're going to talk about here in a moment. But they're not rookies. Nobody, I shouldn't say nobody, but almost nobody's first run at government office is working in the White House, okay? You get a lot of what are called in and outers, right? These are people who bounce between private sector and federal. Okay, usually law and in universities. Okay, you'll get people who will, go back and forth between, and these were just some examples of some of the first women in cabinet positions. Frances Perkins, she was actually a question on Jeopardy last night. She wasn't a question. The answer was Social Security, but they mentioned how she was the first female cabinet member and how she helped draft it. And then you have National Security Advisor, the first African-American woman to later become Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. But you get a lot of inner-outers, okay? What does that mean? I'm going to keep using Kissinger because I like using Kissinger. He was a lawyer. He was a Harvard professor. Actually, he wasn't a law professor. He was a political science professor. But, he got a job working for Richard Nixon. And then he became Secretary of State. And then guess what? When he was done with all that, he went back to teaching, I think, a little bit. Now he was a consultant. Other presidents have called him. He's worked on committees and think tanks. I think he's pretty much retired at this point. But you get a lot of that. You'll do a little government service. You'll go back to work in a job. You'll be called in for some government service. When you get out, you'll get a job working for a corporation or something, right? That's the other thing. Don't think that people who lose their job in the White House end up on food stamps. What happens is you're able to parlay that former job into a pretty sweet gig in the private sector because you're connected. You know people, right? You might have lost your job. It doesn't mean that you lost your contacts. I love to use the term your Rolodex because back in the day, I remember my father had this gigantic thing on his desk. It was called a Rolodex. He would spin it, and basically he had contact information for all these people that he met throughout his career. And you would just kind of roll it, spin it to where you got to the right one. But yeah, that's the thing. My father kept all of these names and numbers and contacts and mailing addresses from a 30, 40-year career. It's no different for these people. If you worked at the Department of Energy, for 4 years, and then you lose your job, I'm willing to bet a power company's going to hire you, right? Because you know all the people in government involved in the energy sector. You know the congressmen that are on the committees, right? You know the representatives. You know the regulatory agencies. You know it all. You were there. You helped make the policy. You're going to get a sweet gig working for Carolina Power or Duke Energy. Or you're going to get offered a position at one of these lobbying groups, for nuclear energy or whatever. And you're going to do that for a while. And then guess what? Your political party is going to win an election. And then a president's going to come calling. And he's going to ask you to come work as his, advisor on nuclear affairs or whatever, right? You're going to bounce back and forth, okay? Which means it's not a full-time government position. You're not a full-time politician, but you do bounce back and forth, okay? Here you go, Donald Rumsfeld. Before he was Secretary of Defense for President George W. Bush, he had been Secretary of Defense and Chief of Staff for Gerald Ford, and before that, a member of Congress, right? Between his terms, working for President Ford and President Bush, which is like a 20-year span, right? Actually, more than 20 years, 25 years. He was an executive at a large pharmaceutical company. Or Vice President Cheney. Vice President Cheney was, he actually, worked in the Ford White House, helping Donald Rumsfeld. He then became a legislator for the state of Wyoming. He eventually left that job and got a sweet gig working for a oil company, basically, Halliburton, if I remember correctly, right? Who basically built oil wells and developed those sorts of things. And then he eventually got tapped to be vice president. So that's the sort of career path you can expect. Now, all right, presidential program. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about that game plan, right? When the president rolls in and is like, here's what I want to do, okay? First of all, if you're hoping to have some guidance in law, there is none, okay? The Constitution doesn't really help. The Constitution says that you have to give a report on the state of the union and that you take such measures as you shall judge necessary and expedient, and that you are to take care of the laws be faithfully executed. That's it. That's it. There's no other direction. There's no other guidance. Remember, when we first made the office of the presidency, hang on, we're going to roll back. When we first made the office of the presidency, we didn't really expect you to do a whole lot, right? For quite a while, you were just supposed to sit there and twiddle your thumbs. And now it's the modern day world. And you've spent like 3 years running for president. And you've given hundreds of speeches and dozens of rallies. And you've gone through a bunch of debates. And you've said things. And you've made promises. And you've kissed babies. And you shook hands. And you begged, borrowed, and stealed to get votes from all these groups. And now everyone's looking at you to do it. You've got to turn campaign promises into actual results. How are you going to do that? Well, first you've got to fill the hundreds of positions that you're supposed to fill, the positions we just talked about. Yes, you've got to give a State of the Union address, which is funny because you got to give the State of the Union just a few weeks after you've been sworn in. So I guess you're supposed to give a State of the Union address on the union that you've inherited. Okay? You've got to get ready to submit a new budget. You've got a ton of stuff to do, right? What are you going to do? Well, it depends. There are two ways, okay? Let's look at the first example. President Carter and President Clinton, you basically showed up with a big old binder of here's what we're going to do. All right, Carter and Clinton showed up with these broad, sweeping agendas. They were like, we're going to do A through Z, right? They had something for everything. Now, that requires you to spend an enormous amount of time having your own small army help you do it, where you plan out a policy position for everything. You show up with this great, broad, sweeping plan, agenda. Or you could do like people like President Reagan, where you show up and you've got 3 or 4 things you want to do, and everything else you leave to your subordinates. Another example would be Richard Nixon in some ways. Richard Nixon had 3 or 4 things Richard Nixon cared about, and everything else he could care less about, right? Ronald Reagan, defense, budget. Yeah, that's about it. I mean, not a whole lot else. Right? Ronald Reagan was all about defense and foreign affairs, foreign policy. He talked about cutting taxes and cutting the budget some. That was about it for Ronald Reagan. Cutting bureaucracy some. But, outside of that, he didn't talk a lot else about anything else. Nothing like how Jimmy Carter showed up and wanted to talk about everything under the sun. Right? Now, but even when you show up like a Ronald Reagan and you have a more limited vision, you've got to be careful, right? You can't just decide I'm going to run these 3 plays and that's the end of it. You've got to kind of feel it out. It's not uncommon for presidents to leak information. Now, this is where I have to take a moment. Our current president, I think sometimes that the leaks are actual leaks. I think that there are times where the president, people in his own administration, are yes, leaking stuff to the press. And there are a lot of times I think that the president is screaming and hollering about leaks that aren't real leaks, like they're purposeful leaks. Like he leaked it. Like he didn't leak it. He told someone to leak it, right? Why would a president leak information? It's a trial balloon. You leak something out and you see how the press and the public reacts. You do it before you actually do anything, right? You have an idea, and so you let a little bit of that leak out, and you see how the press and the people react. And if the reaction is really positive, well, then you go that direction. And if you leak it out and people flip out, you deny it. Like what you say is, that is not what we plan to do. That was a discussion that was misrepresented. This darn leaker, who leaked this to the Washington Post is twisting our words. They're taking one memo from a meeting, and you basically have a way to disavow it. Okay? That happens all the time. Reagan had openly said on the campaign trail that he intended to cut taxes. He wanted to spend more on the military. He didn't have to leak that. But he had ideas regarding Social Security and other budgetary cuts. And he leaked it, right? And his opponents also began leaking some of this stuff, right? And he was able to test the winds. Right? That he was able to get an idea of, if I touch this, what's going to happen? If I cut this, what's going to happen? If I make this change, what's the general feel? Right? You kind of float it. It's like a public opinion poll without officially making it a public opinion poll. And what's beautiful is, like I said, you've got deniability in a way, not entirely, but there is a way for you to sort of play it off, and you can do it without committing, obviously. But, I have to touch upon this because, leaking and leakers and everything has been a topic in the White House the past few years. I don't think that Donald Trump is the victim of as many leaks or infiltration as he likes to portray himself to be. I think it's a wonderful smokescreen. It's very smart on his part, right? Because he portrays himself as this victim surrounded by a bunch of thieves, knives out. The truth be, I think a lot of times Don's like, let's float this out there. Let's see how people react. Let's see how my base reacts. Let's see how the Republican Party reacts. And then he goes from there. And hell, good, bad, or indifferent, he claims it was a leaker, right? Because he can just keep that going. But anyhow, anonymous, highly placed anonymous source, right? All the time. Yeah, whatever. That's like an advisor, Or we talked about this before. Senate aides, right? Aides to senators, senator staff. It's not hard for Don to call up Mitch. Hey, Mitch, I need a guy. What's that name of your guy who's buddies with that Washington reporter? So-and-so. All right. I want you to tell what's-his-face to, go have drinks, pass this on. We'll see what happens. It's easy. It's how you do it, right? Now, in addition, though, to the risks of that reaction, that could be poor. There's another issue if you're president that you have to keep in mind. Okay? Excuse me. All right? For one, there's a limit to what you got. Okay? Time is a resource. Attention is a resource. You are the president of the United States. You better be ready for a 90-hour work week. That's no kidding, kids. I always bring this up. Look at a picture of Barack Obama when he started. Look at a picture of Barack Obama when he's done. He didn't age 8 years. He aged 40 years. Okay? Barack Obama was young and hip and vibrant. Barack Obama looks like a grandpa when he leaves. Right? Every president looks very aged by the time they leave. 4 years, that's a lot. 8 years on this job? 8 years on this job will kill a man. All right? You were talking 90 hours a week. Every day for 8 years basically is scheduled from sunrise to sundown. You don't have free time. You're not allowed to just look, I need to take, because you got things scheduled. You can't cancel things. You can't cancel anything. I mean, it happens, but as soon as you cancel, what's going to be in the news? Oh, he's having health problems. Oh, he's overwhelmed. Oh, he's weak. Oh, this. And when you cancel, somebody's going to get mad because they've had this on their calendar for months, and God knows they'd never cancel on you, right? You burn a bridge when you cancel. And then when you try to reschedule it, what do you got to do? You got no time for rescheduling. And so time is a limiting factor, right? During the average year, Congress passes between 400 and 600 bills, each one of which you're supposed to sign, and you're either supposed to sign or you're supposed to veto, or you're supposed to let it go without your signature, which sends a message, right? If you don't sign a bill and it goes through, the message is either I don't agree with this, but I'm not going to veto it because I know I can't, or what? I was too busy. I don't care, right? That offends people. You got to have those little signing ceremonies or those veto stances. You got people knocking on your door morning, noon, and night. You've got phone calls that have to be made. You got to talk to members of Congress. You got to meet with Mitch. You got to meet with Nance. You got to meet with Chuck Schumer. You got to meet with the kid who sold the most cookie boxes in the Girl Scouts or whatever. You got to meet with the leader of this labor union. You got to meet with this person and that person. The ambassador from Kenya is on his way. You got to meet with him. Oh, you're supposed to have that dinner with Macron. He's coming into town next month. Oh, the following month, you got to go to the G8 summit. That's going to take up a few days of your time. Oh, while you're there, you got to pop over to NATO. You're a busy human being, right? And there's only so much time that you can really sit down in the cabinet and hash things out. And there's only so much time you can talk to your advisors. And there's only so much time you can go out from the bully pulpit. And so you got to be ready. You got to be ready. All right? To understand, you can't spend all of your time on what you want to spend your time on. Your time is precious. Second constraint, crisis. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt obviously has to respond to the Depression. Fortunately for him, World War II held off for a few years, so he was able to fight the Depression before he fought World War II. But you have no control. 9/11. I'm not saying that greatly interrupted George W. Bush's plans. I don't really know what he planned to do, per se. But, what do you do if there's a 9/11? Here you go. We're living through one right now. I apologize. I'm sleep deprived. Coronavirus. I am pretty darn certain that this is throwing a monkey wrench into Donald Trump's plans, but he can't ignore it. He's got to address it. It's taking all of his time. Not only is it taking all of his time, he can't do anything else. Like, literally, he can't do anything else because the country's on lockdown, right? As a president, you have to accept the fact that you might have a plan, and that plan gets thrown out the window because, everybody's getting sick, right? Stock market crashes. I'm pretty sure Herbert Hoover wasn't really looking for the market to crash. It did, right? So you've got to understand, you are at the mercy of events out of your control, right? And you're going to have to figure out a way to build a program, run an audible, right? And the third big constraint is the federal government and most federal programs and the federal budget can only move so much, okay? Only under very extreme circumstances can you make dramatic changes to programs and to budgets. The bulk of federal spending is beyond your control in any given year. And the money has to be spent whether you like it or not. So all this talk about how I'm going to balance the budget, let me just go ahead and get this out the way now. It's all a lie. Every time a guy walks in and says, I'm going to balance the budget, he's lying. Okay? He's lying. Because he can't. He can't. Okay. Could he theoretically, maybe, possibly, if he basically pulled out a gun and told everybody to shut up and do what I say, could he do it? Sure. But in the realm of reality, he can't. Because the president cannot cut spending as much as he needs to. Even if he wanted to, he can't. Why? Because budgets for programs are oftentimes set years in advance. It's not a yearly thing. Many programs have their spending already set for several years down the road. Okay? So the president can't say, well, no, next year you only get this much. It was decided 3 years ago when another guy was in the Oval Office how much they get this year. You can't change that. Okay? It was a law, right? So could you change it a few years down the road? Sure. Maybe. Again, if you pull out a gun and threaten all of us, maybe. But you got to remember, those things are precious to certain people. You're going to lose votes. And there are congressmen who need those votes. They're not going to give it up. You might have term limits. They don't. A guy can be in the House of Representatives his whole adult life if he wants to be, right? He's not going to give that up for you. So you got to remember that there's only so much you can do when it comes to federal spending. A lot of these things have a lot of support, both in the Congress and the public. It means that, you can't cut these federal employees, these federal programs, and federal funding, right? And so, in ordinary times, as a president, you've got limited mobility and flexibility. There's only so much you can actually change. You only have so much time. You don't get to determine the circumstances under which you operate, and you actually can only move so far to the left and the right, so to speak. Right? You're in a box. Okay? It's a metaphor I'm going to give. You're in a box. And guess what? The lights are only flipped on so often, right? You're in a box, you're in a room, and the lights are only turned on so often for you to actually know in what direction you're moving. There's no telling if the walls of the box are going to move in or not. And you're in a box. You can only go so far in any one direction, no matter how hard you try, right? I mean, imagine that. I'm going to put you in a big old, okay, we'll just make it a room with movable walls like the trash compactor in Star Wars, right? And I'm going to flick the lights on and off, right, randomly. And there's no telling when the walls are going to move. And again, there's only so far you can move in that room. That's what it's like to be president, okay? It is not easy. Now, again, ordinary times, you're limited, and you got to be selective, all right? Each president talks in big terms, right? Nobody's tentative. Nobody's very slow and compromised. When you run for president, you're big and you're bold, and you talk about new deals and new frontiers and great societies and new federalisms and square deals and fair deals and whatever other deal you want to offer the American people. But underneath it all, you've got to decide what you're going to spend your time and your money on, because you only got so much. And remember, you can't throw it all away, because who knows what's going to happen, right? You might want to think long and hard about how much political clout you want to burn with Obamacare, because who knows, there might be other issues you might have to address, right? And let's be real. Modern day presidents need to devote a lot more time and effort into the economy and foreign affairs than they used to. Because the executive branch plays a much larger role in foreign affairs, and foreign affairs play a much larger role in America's affairs than they once did, and the executive branch plays a lot more active role in the economy than it once did. So these are things that are, again, draining away your time and your attention that weren't necessarily there. So that hopefully gives you a little bit better feel for who works around the president and how the president fills those positions, and what it's kind of like to be president, in sort of day-to-day operations, sort of. We will, in Section 5, look at presidential transition. It's a shorter section. It's only a few pages. I will have to try and give you a slightly updated version, because your book was written before the most recent impeachment, and I would like to at least get you up to date on that one. I will have to make sure that on your test next week that the questions involving impeachment are up to date. So I'm going to go ahead and make a disclaimer now, and I will repeat that disclaimer when we get to 10.5 lecture, that any talk of impeachment, I will make every attempt to make it up to date. So, but we will look at transition, how new presidents coming in, old presidents going out, etc. But again, that is the final lecture for this chapter coming up. You can be loud.